It was a pleasure to burn. It was a special pleasure to see things, okay. To see things blackened, charge the brass nozzle of his fist. No!
Hey y'all, welcome back. When the stresses of being an adult pile up, it can be comforting to revisit something from our youths. For some of us, that means watching an old movie, listening to a record for the first time in years. And for me, that apparently means rereading books I was assigned in high school. Welcome to my series where I do exactly that. I return to books I read, or was supposed to read, in high school and analyze them through the lens of a dumb 23-year-old instead of a dumb 17-year-old. For the pilot episode, I'm going to be analyzing Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. I'll look into its context, analyze its plot structure and messaging, and by the end, I'll have a yay or nay recommendation for you. So without further ado, let's go! Part 1. Context. Fahrenheit 451 was written by Ray Bradbury, a science fiction writer from the mid-20th century who's known for a variety of short story collections and novels. They all discuss important topics ranging from colonialism to the conflict between industrialism and the well-being of people. His magnus opum, Fahrenheit 451, was written during the Red Scare, a time in US history where the government was really heavy on censorship. Surprisingly, the Red Scare wasn't what drove him to write Fahrenheit 451. There's something much more sinister. In the early 50s, TVs weren't super common, but Bradbury saw in them a truncation of information that he perceived as a threat to individual thought. This fear compelled Bradbury to write about the dystopian future of mass media, which eventually became Fahrenheit 451. Now that we understand where he's coming from, let's get to Part 2. The plot. Fahrenheit takes place in an unspecific city in an unspecific year, but what is specific is the damage mass media has dealt. Books have been outlawed and fire departments become an agent of law enforcement, now burning buildings that harbor books. And what grabbed America's attention without books? TV, of course, now on wall-sized screens. There's said to be a variety of programming, but it all feels bland and rather samey. Characters in the book describe the TV shows as having actions but no central conflict, just loud lines of dialogue. Often the shows are accompanied by flashy imagery that's unrelated to the situation at hand, so it's apparent the TV has devolved into meaningless dribble. The universe's TV has also taken on an interesting form. Viewers are given scripts with their lines on it, and the show pauses for the audience to say their lines, but like an episode of Dora, the lines are functionally irrelevant. No one at the station is listening and responding to anything they say. It's just a way to make people feel involved. Diego was real though, change my mind. Outside of TV, the world is pretty clearly in the future. Robots are the tellers at banks, subways are powered by air, and at one point a toast robot is making breakfast. Neat little details like these set the world pretty well. The story centers around Guy Montag, a firefighter. For the last decade, he's been burning down houses of people caught illegally housing books, but one morning he runs into a girl named Clarice, and his life is changed. Everyone in Montag's life is pretty straightforward and complicit, whereas Clarice asks questions. Through more interactions with Clarice and an overdose scare from his wife, Montag begins to question the life he's accepted for so many years. The real linchpin in his radicalization comes when he goes to burn a lady's house, only to have her insist on burning alive with the books. This was new for Montag. Normally cops remove the tenants before the firefighters get there, but there was a fluke. Today, for the first time in Montag's life, he sees how important books can be to people, to the point where they want to die with them. This sends Montag down a self-reflective spiral. Montag's journey is one of self-discovery, and to explain that discovery, I'm going to have to spoil the plot. You have been warned. Montag realizes his thoughts have been under control for years, and that he's not really happy, but he doesn't know how to be happy. He eventually starts reading books he stole from job sites to try to find answers to his unhappiness. This upsets his wife, but he continues. Struggling to find answers, he eventually seeks out someone he met years ago, Faber, who was an English professor before the world turned. Through Faber, Montag realizes the power of books and wants to reprint some to revolutionize the country. His plan catches a snag, though, when it turns out his boss knew he was hiding books all along, and Montag's forced to burn his own house. In a moment of desperation, Montague burns his boss alive, knocks out his coworkers, and makes a run for it. He revisits Faber, gives him some money to fund printing more books, and runs to a river just outside of town, narrowly avoiding the cops. At dawn, Montague emerges from the river and stumbles across a group of men who were once professors and reverends. They reveal they've all memorized a couple books each and plan on passing that knowledge down so that books can be reprinted once the nation figures itself out. As they walk back, Montague recites verses of the Bible to himself, the one book he got a chance to read before he had to burn it. In its summary, the plot may sound like a good, thought-provoking story. We have a man torn between two worlds, acting on his convictions, and eventually joining up with other readers in a protest movement of sorts against the status quo. The details of the plot quickly start to ruin that summarized version. Right off the bat, Montague's internal journey is all over the place. Plot acts like Montague's internal struggle develops slowly over time, taking a lot of opportunities in the first 2 chapters to show his back and forth between rebellion and self-doubt. But on like page 8, the narrator tells us that Montague is changed forever, well before his actions start to change. It feels like Bradbury didn't know if he wanted Montague's change to be immediate or drawn out, so he just went with both options. To make matters worse, we learn that Faber instilled curiosity in Montague over a year before the book starts, and that Montague had a few dozen books stashed away by the time our story begins. Why did so many key points happen before our story starts? Why couldn't all those radicalizing moments happen during the plot? It would be so great to see his complete transformation from unquestioning member of the status quo to full-on rebel. And as it stands, the arc is cheapened by placing all those moments before the book even begins. Finally, in general, the characters are an afterthought. On top of Montague's journey being botched, the side characters are minimal, underdeveloped, and rarely add anything to Montague's journey. Most are pretty one-note and unmemorable, not adding anything to the themes on their own accord, but just kind of in opposition to Montague. Themes and characters should be symbiotic, building off of and reinforcing each other. But in this case, it seems Bradbury had a message he wanted to share and just kind of threw in whatever characters he could think of. With the discussion of structure completed, let's get to the messaging. Part 3. The Messaging. In the world of Fahrenheit 451, TV has made life extremely bleak. Montague's wife, Mildred, is shown as glued to her TV screens and almost incapable of holding a conversation outside of small talk. A first responder tells Montague they get called to save someone from an overdose about 10 times a night. Cars are encouraged to go upwards of 100 miles an hour on the highway, which might not sound like a bad thing till you learn that it was instituted so people had less time to think on their way to work. The culture in general is described as pretty violent, with firefighters gambling over animal fights and Clarice mentioning violent after-school activities. Oh yeah, that's what a book sounds like, you TV-obsessed They run us so ragged at school that by the end of the day we can't do anything but go to bed, or head for a fun park to bully people around, break window panes in the window smasher place, or wreck cars in the car wrecker place with the big steel ball. How did mass media ruin America so completely? It's said a couple times to have been a two-pronged attack. First, the implicit nature of mass media. It's said the TV started the practice of truncating information for easier consumption, which left heady books and pieces of philosophy outside the realm of public consumption. The second part is the activism of American citizens. It's said that people actively protested against and sought to eliminate various books and ideas that were once treasured. Bradbury saw America trending in this horrible direction, so Fahrenheit serves as a cautionary tale. The government is not the culprit in Fahrenheit, but the authoritarian desires of the public eventually motivated the government, which is something that Bradbury warns us to be wary of. Faber bemoans a couple times, as one of the last English professors, that he didn't do more to stop the authoritarians. We, the readers, are supposed to learn from Faber's mistake, not let society get this far. Next, Bradbury warns us against distancing ourselves from challenging pieces of art, seeing those difficult works as the ones that make the soul feel the most alive, and express the human condition in the most authentic way. The emphasis of keeping the spirit of art and curiosity alive is clearly a message that has stuck with people. And to the book's credit, it has some parts that have really stood the test of time. There's a conversation between Montague and one of Mildred's friends where a presidential election is discussed, with the conclusion being that Mildred's friend voted for the charming, handsome candidate instead of the other candidate, specifically because the other guy wasn't as confident and because he was overweight. And if you hadn't noticed, optics are everything in elections these days. While Bradbury didn't predict the internet, he was certainly correct that content would continually get truncated into small bite-sized chunks. Some parts of our current lives look similar to his predictions, but the context behind them is kinda different. TV shows being mindless dribble? That's just like reality TV is today. Which is a response to this book I hate reading. Some of the smartest people I've ever met indulge in trashy TV specifically because it's a nice break. They're not brainless zombies just because they watch The Bachelor. But Piley, we're so glued to our phones these days, just like Mildred was to her TV. Yeah, I know how that feels familiar, but the problem is that when we're glued to our phones these days, we're usually connecting with our friends and family all over the place. Technology in our timeline has brought a lot of people together, whereas in Fahrenheit, technology was made to tear people apart. So it's not really the same. Worst of all, a lot of Fahrenheit is aged like milk. The book has several moments where men slap women to assert authority, namely our protagonist, and the abuse is never questioned. Hope I don't have to explain why that's not great. What aged the worst, though, is the derision the book has for TV. Sure, TV truncates information, but some of the most thought-provoking works come from TV these days. TV didn't turn into this aggregator of society's rot. It became a viable medium for artists to express stories about the human experience. I thought Bradbury loved those stories, but I guess he only cares about them if they're written on a dead tree, which is just some of the worst boomer-tier, phone-bad, book-good bullshit. And while we're finishing the subject of how the book handles TV, I want to touch on probably the worst part of the book, and that's the classism. Fahrenheit is steeped in elitist rhetoric. For starters, the group of men Montag meets after he escapes are all professors from Ivy League schools, and according to Faber, it sounds like most of the surviving literature enthusiasts are ex-professors from Ivy League schools. Why couldn't there be any working-class people in the mix? Some of the most engaging conversations I've had about art have been with people outside of art school. Give me one good reason one of these folks couldn't be a carpenter or a bus driver or a factory worker. You can't, because the only reasons stem from classist assumptions about working-class people not being able to properly appreciate art. Another bit of elitism, Bradbury is unwilling to consider why people turn to escapist media. Montag's boss mentions that because sports were easy to follow, they were encouraged so that people didn't have to think anymore. But Bradbury doesn't stop to consider, maybe shutting your brain off for a little bit is good for working class people increasingly alienated from their labor and seeing their place in the economy diminish. Escapist media is necessary to not completely lose it. Sure, if you have enough money to afford a mansion, maybe you want to spend your nights contemplating the human condition. But for people who have to work in a factory or office for 10 hours a day, they don't have the emotional energy to come home and absorb these heady pieces of art. Not because they're incapable of comprehension, as the book implies, but because they need a fucking break. Bradbury posits the escapist media that provide a break for working class people as a direct threat to his precious intellectual discourse, which is some of the most blatant classism I've ever read. Lastly, the book places a lot of blame for society's collapse at the feet of minority communities. It said the various groups protested certain books, which eventually led all books to being criminalized. Problem is, the examples Bradbury uses are all worthy of criticism and derision from minority communities, namely the children's book, Little Black Sambo, the protest and removal of which he acts like is some great crime when the book itself is the crime. Look at this. Did we need this shit readily in circulation? I'm of the belief, as are many on the left, that we should discuss the flaws of problematic works to learn and grow from them, not destroy them. So in that sense, I agree with Bradbury, but it feels like he's blaming minority communities for the act of even speaking up, as if obedient silence would be preferable. And that's not an idea I'm okay with. Minority communities are not at fault for criticizing the ways media has portrayed them in the past. By placing the blame as he does, Bradbury shows an overt fear of minority communities collectivizing. At one point, Faber bemoans the fearful majority, and I get the logic behind the fear that society will mobilize behind awful ideas, but Bradbury makes it seem like women, the working class, and people of color are the enemy of the Western tradition of literature, which is just so baseless and bigoted. Those are my main issues with the message of Fahrenheit, but before I get to my conclusion, I want to touch on some groups that are left out of the book. Part 4, Not Allowed in the Cool Kid Club. Not only are none of the surviving intellectuals working class, none of them are people of color or women. I get that the book came from a different time, but that's not a valid excuse for its failure to incorporate voices from a broad spectrum. Though their communities were systemically oppressed, some of the most intellectual minds of the 40s were civil rights leaders like Philip Randolph, Eleanor Roosevelt, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Gandhi. Bradbury had plenty of real-life examples of diversity in intellectual communities, so why are none of these guys memorizing books from any modicum of a diverse background? As far as I can tell, Bradbury just forgot that folks other than white men teaching at Harvard had the capacity to be smart and enjoy books. He wrote other stories with powerful people of color, so I can only guess it was unintentional to leave them out of the academic spheres in Fahrenheit. Not only are they left out of the academic club, but there isn't a single person of color to be found in the book. Is it because America became a white ethno-state? It's possible, but it isn't mentioned in the text. Also, though I'm less surprised, queer people aren't mentioned at all. They don't even get to be blamed for causing the fall of America, which is a shame because I know that's central to the gay agenda. As far as women are concerned, they're in the story, but they're almost demonized. In crafting the universe of Fahrenheit 451, Bradbury needed to have a few characters who show the unquestioned reality of the world, how sedentary and lifeless TV made folks. And the characters he chose to express these ideas are exclusively women. Montauk has male co-workers, why couldn't they be voices for the status quo? Why did it have to be women? In a world filled with unquestioning sheep, we're only ever shown women being weak and unable to break out, which feels like an intentional slight. Part 5. Conclusion. Fahrenheit 451 has a reputation that precedes itself. Its merits praised by many and its involvement in high school curriculums is staggering, and yet the discourse surrounding the book is often flaccid. Most of it lacks analysis of plot structure, the silences the book commits, or the classism. It's mostly just folks pointing out how Mildred's deadpan devotion to TV reminds them of reality TV. Within the last few years, people are starting to recontextualize and challenge the book, which is good, but that recontextualization deserves far more national attention. Because it was shocking upon revisiting the book how overt these elements are. And if we're going to have our kids read this book, the points deserve to be addressed. This all leaves me with one final question. Do I recommend this book? No. It's a really messy read, from plot to message to characters. I can only really recommend the book as an exercise. If you, as I did, read the book in high school and loved it, but want to reconfront the book with new lenses, then maybe it's worth your time. But not everyone has that kind of time, and I completely understand prioritizing things you want to see before reading an old book you might not like that much. All in all, I'd give this book a solid meh. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to subscribe down below and click the little bell so you can know the exact nanosecond I release my next video. Also, be sure to follow me on these socials. What are your thoughts on the book? Did you read it when you were one of the youths? What do you remember the takeaways being? I'm really curious, because even though I read it in high school, it wasn't on the school-wide curriculum, so it wasn't as frequently discussed in lunchrooms or what have you as something like To Kill a Mockingbird. Is this a topic you'd want to see more of? If not, tough luck, because I have a few more already planned. But if so, what are some books you would like to see me revisit? Would love some suggestions, everybody. Thanks, y'all, and I'll see you next time.